will rid me of this turbulent priest?" These are words spoken by King Henry II, but historians have argued for centuries over if these words were the cause of Thomas Becket's brutal assassination at the orders of the king, or if it was just a terrible misunderstanding. You see, in 1162, Henry II appointed Thomas Becket as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry and Thomas had been good friends previously to this, and upon the death of the previous Archbishop, Theobald, Thomas Becket was Henry's first choice to take up the position, as well as being Chancellor to the King. Henry II wholeheartedly believed that Thomas Becket would do anything he asked of him and act in accordance to the will of the King, and to support him in the running of the country. But the King was wrong. In the same year, Thomas resigned as Chancellor, as he wanted to focus on his role as the Archbishop of Canterbury and increase the power and influence held by the Church. This is what angered Henry II initially, and the relationship between the pair deteriorated greatly. 2 years later, in 1164, King Henry then tried to pass the laws of the Constitutions of Clarendon. These were to limit the powers held by the Church and increase the influence a king held over bishops. But Becket refused to agree to these, and subsequently, Thomas Becket was then put on trial for disobeying the king. The relationship Thomas Becket and King Henry II had was now completely destroyed. Thomas, who then feared for his life after the trial, fled to France, and for around 6 years Thomas Becket, who still held the Archbishop of Canterbury title, lived in France. But this arrangement didn't really work for the king, who was at the time worrying about his succession, and as he wanted to protect his son's claim, he had him crowned junior king in a coronation performed by the Archbishop of York. However, coronations were and are still performed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and by having the Archbishop of York step up to do the task, Henry II angered Thomas Becket, who, after appealing to the Pope, and eventually Henry, resolved some differences and returned to England. But Thomas Becket, possibly in a bid to assert himself, wrote a letter that excommunicated the Archbishop of York and 2 bishops who were also involved in the coronation, and this greatly angered the king. Henry II was now beyond furious. Thomas Becket was once his friend, a man he trusted would follow his wishes, but he let him down and put the interests of the Church above those of a friend and the king. So Henry shouted in a rage, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" Were these Henry's actual words? There is doubt, but regardless, the consequences were terrible. 4 of Henry's knights heard his shout and, upon their own interpretation, rode to Canterbury. The altercation that follows their arrival in Canterbury is actually recorded in the eyewitness accounts of 5 individuals, who surprisingly all agree, broadly, on the details of what took place. The most in-depth account is from a man called Edward Grimm, a monk who was visiting the cathedral on the day of Becket's murder. Grimm states that the 4 knights arrived at the cathedral and Thomas Becket was at that point in the Archbishop's palace. An attempt to arrest Becket was made, but he refused, and after being persuaded by the monks to take refuge in the church, the knights then pursued him. They burst into the cathedral with their swords drawn, and all of those inside were terrified. Edward Grimm states they shouted the following: "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and the kingdom?" The knights then rushed at him, roughly manhandling and dragging him, intending to kill him outside the church and carry him away in chains. Grimm goes on to say that Thomas Becket held on with all of his might to a cathedral pillar to try and prevent them from seizing him. This was then the first time a knight lifted his sword, bringing it down upon the crown of Becket's head. Blood had now been drawn, and the other knights started to join in. The other monks fled when the attack started, and upon the 3rd blow, Thomas Becket was killed. Edward Grimm goes on to say that by the end of the attack, Becket's crown separated from the head so that the blood turned white from the brain, and the brain equally red from the blood. Accompanying the knights was a clerk who, upon his involvement, became known as Mal Clerk or Evil Clerk, and Edward Grimm states that he put his foot on the neck of the holy priest and precious martyr, and, horrible to say, scattered the brains with the blood over the pavement. "Let us go, knights," he called out to the others. "This fellow will not get up again." Now, a more in-depth account from Edward Grimm states, "The murderers arrived in full armour with sword and axes. The monks begged the Archbishop to hide in the cathedral for his own safety, but he refused. This was because he wanted to be a martyr for a long time. However, the monks took no notice of him, seized him and bundled him into the cathedral, bolting the doors behind them." Becket said, "It was wrong to make the house of prayer into a fortress, and he ordered the doors to be kept open. The knight, following with rapid steps, shouted, 'Where is the Archbishop Thomas Becket, a traitor to his king and country?' Becket answered, 'I'm here. I'm a priest of God, not a traitor. I won't run from your swords.' The knights tried to drag Becket from the cathedral, but he clung to a pillar, bending his head as if in prayer. One of the knights, Reginald Fitzgerald, struck him on his head. He received a second blow to the head, but stood firm, and the third blow he fell to his knees and whispered, 'In the name of Jesus, I am ready to die.' The next blow sliced off the top of his head, and the stone floor was stained with the blood white with brain, and the brain red with blood. The 4 knights stopped anyone from interfering with what they were doing, and the 5th put his foot on Becket's neck. With the tip of his sword he scattered the rest of Becket's brain over the floor and shouted to the others, 'Let's go. This fellow will not be getting up again.' Now, after Thomas Becket had been cut down by the knights, his body remained untouched for several hours. No one present knew what to do, so Thomas Becket lay where he had fallen. Individuals from the town flooded into the cathedral and then dipped parts of their clothing into his blood and collected it in small vessels to take away in an anticipation of his future sanctity. A blind woman applied a bloody rag to her eyes and claimed to regain her sight, and a sick woman who drank a mixture of his blood and water declared herself healed. Thomas Becket in all spent the rest of the night and into the early hours of the next day upon the high altar of Canterbury Cathedral. Monks then buried him within the crypt in a marble coffin at the eastern edge. But reports then began to circulate of miraculous healings linked to Thomas Becket, abilities that in life he did not possess. Pilgrims began to descend upon Canterbury. It wasn't, however, just the wounded or sick hoping for a miracle. Dignitaries came with gifts. Louis VII brought a huge ruby called the regale, a cup crafted of pure gold, and an annual wine stipend of around 1,600 gallons for the monks. With increasing pressure from the community, the monks decided to open the crypt and allow pilgrims to visit his tomb, and from then on, an extraordinary wave of miracles was reported. So in recognition of Becket's new-found abilities after death, he was made a saint. Thomas Becket is also the fastest recorded individual in history to have been canonised after his death. He now has a reputation as a miracle-working saint, and the news was spreading fast. People from all over Europe came to see his tomb in the hopes of miraculous healing and miracle granting. His blood was sold in small trinkets in a blood and water mixture called St. Thomas's water. This was sold by monks who saw an opportunity to try and make some money. They used small trinket vessels called ampulla. Henry II, who was supposedly feeling guilty for his involvement in the murder, and as an act of penance visited the tomb in 1174, and he granted his approval to the Becket cult. Now, the miracles that supposedly occurred transformed Canterbury into one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in the whole of Europe. As such, his body was moved in 1220 to a new shrine in a purpose-built chapel upstairs in the cathedral. In death, Thomas Becket remained a figure of resistance to the unrestricted power, and as such became the archetype defender of the rights of the Church. But his story didn't end there. Thomas Becket's bones now resided in a gilded casket that was topped by a canopy of sapphires, diamonds, emeralds and rubies, including the regale. In 1512, Erasmus visited and stated that every part glistened, shone and sparkled with rare and very large jewels, some exceeding the size of a goose's egg. When a pilgrim approached the tomb, a series of pulleys would lift the canopy, tinkling with silver bells. Each jewel would be pointed out and their donors would be named. Now this is what happened up until the Reformation, and you have Henry VIII to thank for that. In 1538, a few years after Henry VIII split from Rome, he outlawed the worship of relics. He wasn't a Protestant himself, but he encouraged the Reformation as a way to maintain his independence from Rome, and Protestants really hated relics. John Calvin called them execrable sacrilege, and Martin Luther attacked them in his 95 Theses. So shrines were demolished, statues were smashed up, and relics were taken away and thrown into the bin. Henry VIII's commissioners arrived at Canterbury Cathedral in the September of 1538, and it's believed they stripped away all the gold and jewels from the shrine and tomb and took them away to the Tower of London. It's also believed that the regale became a royal thumb ring. The bones of Becket, however, have an even more interesting story. You see, they are believed to have been burnt and scattered to the wind, and this is what the Pope reported, and the account has been accepted as fact in Europe, but not the British Isles. In England, royal statements suggest that the bones had not in fact been burned, and that they had merely been hidden so they could no longer be worshipped. If you visited Canterbury Cathedral today, you will only find a small white candle on the floor, marking the spot where the shrine once stood. But inside of the cathedral, many secrets are hidden, and in 1888, a team who were excavating an earlier Norman church made a discovery that has fascinated historians ever since. The stone floor of the eastern crypt was broken through, and a long, thin stone coffin was discovered. The coffin is believed to have been discovered in a location that was exactly right next to the spot where Becket's coffin once stood. Inside the coffin was a jumble of bones, and to establish if the monks did in fact save Thomas Becket's remains, the cathedral officials gave the bones to a local surgeon called W. Pewin Thornton. Now Thornton examined the bones and said they were very old, but he couldn't say how old. He also said they were from a man who was roughly the same height and age as Thomas Becket. He also said the skull areas showed damage that indicated a blow from some sort of weapon, particularly on the left side. The straight border of the large crack therefore seemed consistent with a wound caused by a heavy cutting instrument such as a two-handed sword. These bones stayed above ground for 16 days. Long enough that a boy who had failing sight was taken to them in the hopes of being healed. His father wholeheartedly believed the bones were Thomas Becket's. But not everyone was convinced. Questions surrounding the wound to the skull emerged as the skull was discovered to be intact. Those who were sceptical found the skull to be the deciding evidence to determine the owner of the bones, and it was emphasised in medieval writings that the top of Becket's skull was severed during his murder, so how could this skull have belonged to a saint? Skeptics remained, and over the years the consensus evolved. Thornton believed the bones to be that of Thomas Becket. He had convinced himself, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1920, in a report gathering all of the evidence, agreed with him. In 1949, it was then decided by the church to erect a monument for Becket to mark the spot where the skeleton was found. However, first they decided to once again inspect the bones, and an anatomy professor called Alexander Cave of St Bartholomew's Hospital inspected them, and it was a good job he did. For science had come a long way, and the bones were analysed for 2 years, and it was stated that they had been warped as though they'd been buried in soil for a long time. They also displayed indications of cuts from a spade, making Cave believe they were exhumed in a hurry. Now, neither of these points were consistent with what was actually believed to have happened to Thomas Becket, and the most damning piece of evidence to dismiss the body as Becket's is the evidence concerning the skull. Now, when the skull was examined, it was determined, by the shape of the fractures and the bony tissue beneath, that nothing on the skull indicated it had suffered trauma before death. The cracks on the skull were natural decay and pressure of the earth on the bones. Cave concluded that unless the accounts of Thomas Becket's death were incorrect, there was no way that the bones discovered in 1888 could be his. Now, even though the body, thought to have been Thomas Becket's, was proven otherwise, there is still a belief that somewhere within Canterbury Cathedral is the remains of Thomas Becket. In 1997, an English biochemist who was also a scholar named Cecil Humphrey Smith told the Times of London that his godfather, Canterbury Canon Julian Bickersteth, had witnessed the exhumation of a body near to the cathedral's chapel of St Mary Magdalene and St Nicholas in 1943, and according to Humphrey Smith, the bones that Bickersteth saw were a tall man. Becket was known for his stature and did not include the right hand, which some say was severed after Becket's death. Humphrey Smith also claimed that fragments of Becket's episcopal vesture and seal ring had also been visible. Those who believe the stories point out that Bickersteth and Canon John Shirley paid to renovate the 2 chapels in the 1950s, and that Shirley's own sister's ashes were interred in St Mary Magdalene's chapel, and that a red perpetual lamp which resides in the chapel is in fact the colour of martyrdom, and that itself is indicating the presence of Thomas Becket. It's an interesting theory. Thomas Becket's long journey came to an end with the Reformation during the reign of King Henry VIII, but his spirit, or the thought of him, still lingers in the minds of some. He was killed at the behest of an old friend, Henry II, but through his canonising he remained a saint for the rest of history, and in the eyes of some granted miracles to those in need. Regardless of whether the bones found were actually him or not, he still remains a prominent point of religious history, especially for Canterbury Cathedral. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.